Like a shooting star across the red sky, Cassida flew over the dunes and made the jump across the cleaver as if she were leaping over a brook. They paused only long enough for the horse to rest and fill up on water, and though Celeana apologized to the mare for pushing her so hard, Cassida never faltered. She too seemed to sense the urgency. They rode through the night until the crimson dawn broke over the dunes and smoke stained the sky, and the fortress spread before them. Fires burned here and there, and shouts rang out, along with the clashing of weapons. The assassins hadn't yielded yet, though their walls had been breached. A few bodies littered the sand leading up to the gates, but the gates themselves showed no sign of a forced entry, as if someone had left them unlocked. Celeana dismounted Cassida before the final dune, leaving the horse to either follow or find her own path, and crept the rest of the way into the fortress. She paused long enough to swipe a sword from a dead soldier and tuck it into her belt. It was cheaply made and unbalanced, but the point was sharp enough to do the job. From the muffled clopping of the hooves behind her, she knew Cassida had followed. Still, Celeana didn't dare take her eyes away from the scene before her, as she drew her two long daggers. Inside the walls, bodies were everywhere, assassins and soldiers alike. Otherwise, the main courtyard was empty, its little river now flowing red. She tried her best to not look too closely at the faces of the fallen. Fires smouldered, most of them just smoking piles of ash. Charred remnants of arrows revealed that they probably were ablaze when they hit. Every step into the courtyard felt like a lifetime. The shouts and clanging weapons came from other parts of the fortress. Who was winning? If all the soldiers had gotten in, with so few dead on the sand, then someone had to have let them in, probably in the dead of night. How long had it taken before the night watch spotted the soldiers creeping inside? Unless the night watch had been dispatched before they could sound the alarm. But as Celeana took step after step, she realized that the question she should be asking was far worse. Where is the Master? That was what Lord Beric had wanted, the Master's head. And Ansel... Celeana didn't want to finish that thought. Ansel hadn't sent her away because of this. Ansel couldn't be behind this. But... Celeana started sprinting for the Master's greeting room, heedless of the noise. Blood and destruction were everywhere. She passed courtyards full of soldiers and assassins, locked in deadly battle. She was halfway up the stairs to the Master's room when a soldier came rushing down them, his blade drawn. She ducked the blow for her head and struck low and deep, her long dagger burying itself in his gut. With the heat, the soldiers had foregone metal armor, and their leather armor couldn't turn a blade made with Ardlanian steel. She jumped aside as he groaned and tumbled down the steps. She didn't bother sparing him a final look as she continued her ascent. The upper level was completely silent. Her breath sharp in her throat, she careened towards the open doors of the greeting room. The 200 soldiers were meant to destroy the fortress and provide a distraction. The Master could have been unguarded with everyone focused on the attack, but he was still the Master. How could Ansel expect to best him? Unless she used that drug on him as well. How else would she be able to disarm him and catch him unawares? Celeana hurled herself through the open doors, nearly tripping on a body prostrate between them. Mikhail lay on his back, his throat slit, eyes staring up at the tiled ceiling. Dead. Beside him was Elias, struggling to rise as he clutched his bleeding belly. Celeana picked back her cry, and Elias raised his head, blood dripping from his lips. She made to kneel beside him, but he grunted, pointing to the room ahead, to his father. The master lay on his side atop the dais, his eyes open and his robes still unstained by blood. But he had the stillness of one drugged, paralyzed by whatever Ansel had given him. The girl stood over him, her back to Celeana as she talked, swift and quick, babbling. She clenched her father's sword in one hand, the bloodied blade drooping towards the floor. The master's eyes shifted to Celeana's face, then his son's. They were filled with pain, not for himself, but for Elias, for his bleeding boy. He looked back to Celeana's face, his sea-green eyes now pleading. "Save my son!" Ansel took a deep breath, and the sword rose in the air, making to slice off the master's head. Celeana had a heartbeat to flip a knife into her hands. She cocked it with her wrist and let it fly. The dagger slammed into Ansel's forearm, exactly where Celeana had aimed. Ansel let out a cry, her fingers splayed, her father's sword clattering to the ground. Her face went white with shock as she whirled, clutching the bleeding wound. But the expression shifted into something dark and unyielding as she beheld Celeana. Ansel scrambled for her fallen blade, but Celeana was already running. Ansel grabbed her sword, dashing back to the master and lifting it high over her head. She plunged the sword towards the master's neck. Celeana managed to tackle her before the blade struck, sending them both crashing to the floor, cloth and steel and bone twisting and rolling. She brought her legs up high enough to kick Ansel. The girls split apart, and Celeana was on her feet the moment she stopped moving. But Ansel was already standing, her sword still in her hands, still between Celeana and the paralyzed master. The blood from Ansel's arm dripping to the floor. They panted, and Celeana steadied her reeling head. "Don't do it." Ansel let out a low laugh.
I thought I told you to go home.
Celeana drew her sword from her belt. If only she had a blade like Ansel's, not some bit of scrap metal. It shook in her hands as she realized who exactly stood between her and the master. Not some nameless soldier, not some stranger, or a person she'd been hired to kill, but Ansel. "Why?" Celeana whispered. Ansel cocked her head, raising her sword a bit higher.
Why?
Celeana had never seen anything more hideous than the hate that twisted Ansel's face.
Oh, because Lord Beric promised me 1,000 men to march into the Flatlands. That's why. Stealing those horses was the public excuse he needed to attack this fortress. And all I had to do was take care of the guards and leave the gate open last night. And bring him this.
She gestured with her sword to the master behind her.
The master's head.
She ran an eye up and down Celeana's body, and Celeana hated herself for trembling further.
Put down your sword, Celeana.
Celeana didn't move. "Go to hell." Ansel chuckled.
I've been to hell. I spent some time there when I was 12, remember? And when I march into the Flatlands with Beric's troops, I'll see to it that the High King Locke sees a bit of hell too. But first...
She turned to the master, and Celeana sucked in a breath. "Don't!" Celeana said. From this distance, Ansel would kill him before she could do anything to stop her.
Just look the other way, Celeana.
Ansel stepped closer to the man.
If you touch him, I'll put a sword through your neck.
Celeana snarled. The words shook, and she blinked away, the building moisture behind her eyes. Ansel looked over her shoulder.
I don't think you will.
Ansel took another step closer to the master, and Celeana's second dagger flew. It grazed the side of Ansel's armour, leaving a long mark before it clattered to a stop in front of the dais. Ansel paused, giving Celeana a faint smile.
You missed.
Don't do it!
Why?
Celeana put a hand over her heart, tightly gripping her sword with the other.
Because I know what it feels like.
She dared another step.
I know how it feels to have that kind of hate, Ansel. I know how it feels, and this isn't the way. This!
She said louder, gesturing to the fortress and all the corpses in it. All the soldiers and assassins still fighting.
This is not the way!
Says the assassin!
Ansel spat.
I've become an assassin because I had no choice. But you have a choice, Ansel. You've always had a choice. Please don't kill him.
Please don't make me kill you, was what she truly meant to say. Ansel shut her eyes. Celeana steadied her wrist, testing the balance of her blade, trying to get a sense of its weight. When Ansel opened her eyes, there was little of the girl she had grown to care for over the past month.
These men!
Ansel said, her sword raising higher.
These men destroy everything!
I know.
You know, and yet you do nothing! You're just a dog chained to your master.
She closed the distance between them, her sword lowering. Celeana almost sagged with relief, but didn't lighten her grip on her own blade. Ansel's breathing was ragged.
You could come with me. The two of us alone could conquer the Flatlands, and with Lord Beric's troops we...
Her hand grazed Celeana's cheek, and Celeana tried not to recoil at the touch, and at the words that came out of Ansel's mouth.
I'd make you my right hand. We'd take the Flatlands back.
I can't.
Celeana answered, even though she could see Ansel's plan with perfect clarity, even if it was tempting. Ansel stepped back.
What does Rifthold have that's so special? How long will you bow and scrape for that monster?
I can't go with you, and you know it. So take your troops and leave, Ansel.
She watched the expressions flitter across Ansel's face. Hurt. Denial. Rage.
So be it.
She struck, and Celeana only had time to tilt her head to dodge the hidden dagger that shot out of Ansel's wrist. The blade grazed her cheek, and blood warmed her face. Her face! Ansel swiped with her sword, so close that Celeana had to flip herself backwards. She landed on her feet, but Ansel was fast, and near enough that Celeana could only bring up her blade. Their swords met. Celeana spun, shoving Ansel's sword from hers. Ansel stumbled, and Celeana used the moment to gain an advantage, striking again and again. Ansel's superior blade was hardly impacted. They passed the prostrate master and the dais. Celeana dropped to the ground, swiping at Ansel with a leg. Ansel leapt back, dodging the blow. Celeana used the precious seconds to snatch her fallen dagger from where it lay on the dais steps. When Ansel struck again, she met the crossed blades of Celeana's sword and dagger. Ansel let out a low laugh.
How do you imagine this ending?
She pressed Celeana's blades.
Or is it a fight to the death?
Celeana braced her feet against the floor. She'd never known Ansel was so strong, or so much taller than her. And Ansel's armour, how would she get through that? There was a joint between the armpits and the ribs, and then around her neck.
Ugh, you tell me! You seem to have everything planned.
Celeana said. The blood from her cheek slid down her throat.
I tried to protect you!
Ansel shoved hard against Celeana's blades, but not strong enough to dislodge them.
And you came back anyway.
You call that protection? Drugging me and leaving me in the desert?
Celeana bared her teeth. But before she could launch another assault, Ansel struck her with her free hand, right across the X made by their weapons. Her fist slammed between Celeana's eyes. Celeana's head snapped back, the world flashing, and she landed hard on her knees, her sword and dagger clattering to the floor. Ansel was on her in a second, her bloodied arm across Celeana's chest, and the other hand pressing the edge of her sword against Celeana's unmarred cheek.
Give me one reason not to kill you right here.
Ansel whispered into her ear, kicking away Celeana's sword. Her fallen dagger lay near them, just out of reach. Celeana struggled, trying to put some distance between Ansel's sword and her face.
Oh, how vain can you be?
Ansel said, and Celeana winced as the sword dug into her skin.
Afraid I'll scar your face?
Ansel angled the sword downwards, the blade now biting into Celeana's throat.
What about your neck?
Stop it!
I didn't want it to end this way between us. I didn't want you to be a part of this.
Celeana believed her. If Ansel wanted to kill her, she would have already done it. If she wanted to kill the Master, she would have done it already too. And all this waffling, between sadistic hate and passion and regret.
You're insane!
Ansel snorted.
Who killed Mikhail?
Celeana demanded. Anything to keep her talking, to keep her focused on herself. Because just a few feet away lay her dagger.
I did.
Ansel said, a little of the fierceness fading from her voice. Her back pressed against Ansel's chest. Celeana couldn't be sure without seeing Ansel's face, but she could have sworn the words were tinged with remorse.
When Beric's men attacked, I made sure I was the one who told the Master. The fool didn't sniff once at the jug he drank from before he went to the gates. But then Mikhail figured out what I was doing and burst in here. Too late to stop the Master from drinking, though. And then Elias just got in the way.
Celeana looked at Elias, who still laid on the ground, still breathing. The Master watched his son, his eyes wide and pleading. If someone didn't staunch Elias's bleeding, he'd die soon. The Master's fingers twitched slightly, making a curving motion.
How many others did you kill?
Celeana asked, trying to keep Ansel distracted as the Master made the motion again. A kind of slow, strange wiggling.
Only them. And the 3 on night watch. I let the soldiers do the rest.
The Master's fingers twitched and slithered, like a snake. One strike. That was all it would take. Just like the asp. Ansel was fast. Celeana had to be faster.
You know what, Ansel?
Celeana breathed, memorizing the motions she'd have to make in the next few seconds, imagining her muscles moving, praying not to falter, to stay focused. Ansel pressed the edge of the blade into Celeana's throat.
What? Celeana!
You want to know what the Master taught me during those lessons?
She felt Ansel tense. felt the question distract her. It was all the opportunity she needed.
This! Celeana twisted, slamming her shoulder into Ansel's torso. Her bones connected against the armour with a jarring thud, and the sword cut into Celeana's neck. But Ansel lost her balance and teetered back. Celeana hit Ansel's fingers so hard they dropped the sword right into Celeana's waiting hand. In a flash, like a snake turning in on itself, Celeana pinned Ansel face down on the ground, her father's sword now pressing against the back of her neck. Celeana hadn't realised how silent the room was until she was kneeling there, one knee holding Ansel to the ground, the other braced on the floor. Blood seeped from where the sword tip rested against Ansel's tanned neck, redder than her hair.
Don't do it,
Ansel whispered, in that voice that she'd heard so often. That girlish, carefree voice. But had it always been a performance? Celeana pushed harder, and Ansel sucked in a breath, closing her eyes. Celeana tightened her grip on the sword, willing steel into her veins. Ansel should die for what she'd done. She deserved to die. And not just for all the assassins lying dead around them, but also for the soldiers who'd spent their lives for her agenda. And for Celeana herself, who, even as she knelt there, felt her heart breaking. Even if she didn't put the sword through Ansel's neck, she'd still lose her. She'd already lost her. But maybe the world had lost Ansel long before today. Celeana couldn't stop her lips from trembling as she asked,
Was it ever real?
Ansel opened an eye, staring at the far wall.
There were some moments when it was. The moment I sent you away. That was real.
Celeana reined in her sob and took a long, steadying breath. Slowly, she lifted the sword from Ansel's neck, only a fraction of an inch. Ansel made to move, but Celeana pressed the steel against her skin again, and she went still. From outside came cries of victory and concern, in voices that sounded hoarse from disuse. How long before they got here? If they saw Ansel, saw what she had done, they'd kill her.
You have 5 minutes to pack your things and leave the fortress. Because in 20, I'm going up to the battlements, and I'm going to fire an arrow at you. And you better hope that you're out of range by then, because if not, that arrow is going straight through your neck.
Celeana lifted the sword. Ansel slowly got to her feet, but didn't flee. It took Celeana a heartbeat to realise she was waiting for her father's sword. Celeana looked at the wolf-shaped hilt and the blood staining the steel. The one tie Ansel had left to her father, her family, and whatever twisted shred of hope burned in her heart. Celeana turned the blade and handed it hilt first to Ansel. The girl's eyes were damp as she took the sword. She opened her mouth, but Celeana cut her off.
Go home, Ansel.
Ansel's face went white again. She sheathed the sword at her side. She glanced at Celeana only once before she took off at a sprint, leaping over Mikhail's corpse as if he were nothing more than a bit of debris. And then she was gone.